As is the hope with any E3, something unexpected, maybe for a subsection of the gaming community, happened last week. And I'm not even talking about anything that we did get. What throws me off, the thing that shocked me about this E3 the most, is what we didn't see. I've personally been pulling for Banjo and Kazooie's inclusion in the Super Smash Bros. Ultimate roster since I saw the budding relationship between Microsoft and Nintendo. So when that was announced, I thought for sure we would finally see a full return of Banjo and Kazooie to modern day gaming. Obviously, that didn't happen, but it could and it should. Let's talk about it. For any and all of you that haven't played any Banjo-Kazooie games in the past, and I mean any of the real Banjo-Kazooie games, not any of this nuts and bolts nonsense, here's a bit of a refresher course. Banjo-Kazooie and its sequel, Banjo-Tooie, a Rare Studios developed 3D sandbox collectathon platformer starring a bear named Banjo and his bird friend Kazooie. The original game went through a few iterations during its creation, and it was in development since the release of Donkey Kong Country 2 in 1995 and was originally meant to be an isometric RPG called Dreams for the Super Nintendo. Long story short, the game became way too ambitious to fit on SNES, then too small in scope to compare favorably with Super Mario 64. Ultimately though, somewhere along the way, arguably became the better game of the two, at least in my opinion. Since then, the IP has become the property of Microsoft through their acquisition of Rare Studios, which resulted in a lot of the original Banjo team leaving to do other things, like eventually going on to form Playtonic Games. Microsoft has done little to nothing with the franchise beyond HD re-releases of the original games, the aforementioned mistake known as Banjo-Kazooie Nuts and Bolts, the inclusion of the remakes and that mistake in Rare Replay, and now the inclusion of Banjo and Kazooie in Super Smash Bros. Ultimate. To this day, Banjo-Kazooie has been one of the most influential games of its era, even despite the fact that it was less popular than games like Super Mario 64 or Crash Bandicoot. I think it's way past time for that franchise to make a major comeback, and I think it's possible that it'll do so. And to make things even better on the Nintendo Switch, despite the fact that it's a Microsoft-owned IP now. First of all, it's hard to believe that any publisher would completely pass up on the marketing opportunity that is a roster inclusion for their character in a Super Smash Bros. Game. Capcom used the opportunity to bring Mega Man back into the public eye with re-releases and eventually a brand new game, Mega Man 11. The same could be said with Konami via Simon and Richter Belmont by way of the Castlevania collection. They dropped the ball with Metal Gear, of course, but what else is new? Cloud Strife saw his original game make its way to Switch, and I wouldn't be surprised to see Final Fantasy VII Remake do the same, as Square confirmed at the time of its initial release that it would be a timed exclusive for PlayStation. I think Banjo and Kazooie will join those ranks in an even bigger, more symbolic way than those other franchise characters did, given its past and the current relationship that Nintendo and Microsoft have. Even looking at that past, it wouldn't be the first time a Microsoft-owned Banjo-Kazooie game released on a Nintendo platform. It wouldn't even be the second. Rare developed games for Game Boy Advance post-acquisition that all began development when they were still a mostly independent studio. These all had Microsoft's blessing because they didn't see the Game Boy Advance as direct competition, much in the same way that they now see the Switch, only this time it's on the complete other side of the spectrum. They now clearly see the Nintendo Switch as an ally that adds to their mission to proliferate their software and service business further than their hardware alone makes possible. So yeah, I want to see Banjo-Kazooie make its way back to the gaming world, but I don't think it should be as simple as porting over the 360 era HD ports or even porting over Rare Replay. I think it would be best if we saw a few key things happen with the revival of Banjo-Kazooie. First and foremost, I think rather than doing the obvious and porting things like Rare Replay to Switch, they should create a Banjo-Kazooie branded collection that includes from the ground up remakes for all of the games in the Banjo-Kazooie franchise, akin to what we've seen with Crash Bandicoot. I want Banjo-Kazooie, Banjo-Tooie, and even Nuts and Bolts, Gruntilda, Matilda's Revenge, and Banjo Pilot, all with more modern controls, although I'd argue the original 2 games don't need much work in that regard. Upgraded character models to all be more in line with the current iteration we see in Super Smash Bros. Ultimate, scrapped features from the original releases like the multiplayer plan for Banjo Pilot, and some other odds and ends like behind the scenes content. I don't think this should be developed by Rare Studios though. They clearly aren't the same team that made those original games. And the people still there are in a different wheelhouse than what I feel is necessary to make something like this. I wouldn't even say the best team for this would be Playtonic Games, or at least I wouldn't say having this game being done entirely by them would be the best course of action. And that's because I don't think we need the games to feel like the original games did on the N64, Game Boy Advance, and especially not the Xbox 360 in the case of Nuts and Bolts. They need to feel like they do in our memory, which is to say better than what is the reality. Playtonic being involved in a consultation role would be preferred in my opinion, but I think ultimately a new young team that experienced the originals but also have a good understanding of what makes modern platformers good would be the best course of action here. Apart from EPD, but I don't think Nintendo likes Microsoft that much to have one of their studios develop a game that'll be released on an Xbox. Although giving it to Nintendo would give them a ton of options for talent that would be perfect for a game like this, say Retro Studios or, like I said before, EPD. Outside of Nintendo, studios I think could make this remake well would have to be Sanzaru Games, who worked on the Sly Cooper trilogy remaster and the 4th game in that series, because they're an independent studio that has shown they have the ability to iterate on an established IP, or preferably Gears for Breakfast, who's the development studio behind A Hat in Time, a game that was clearly heavily influenced by Banjo-Kazooie and games of its ilk. To add to that, at the risk of making people angry, I wouldn't be surprised if Microsoft continued their buying spree to grab up an independent game development team like one of these to head up games in the Banjo-Kazooie franchise, in a similar vein to what they've been doing recently with their studio acquisitions to compare more favorably with established brands out of Nintendo and PlayStation, or even in the past with the likes of 343 Industries for Halo or the Coalition for Gears of War. As one of their few existing pre-established IP and easily one of their most iconic franchises second only to Halo, I think it's time for Microsoft to found a new studio with a focus on Banjo-Kazooie projects. Give me Honeypot Studios or whatever. This would accomplish a few things. It would use the hype garnered by Banjo and Kazooie's inclusion in Super Smash Bros. Ultimate as a springboard to reintroduce them into the modern day zeitgeist. It would familiarize the new team responsible for the Banjo franchise from this point forward with what made the original games tick on a deeper level than playing them as a consumer product alone could ever do. The critical and commercial reception for these remakes would work as a good barometer for what still works from the original, since remakes from the ground up are easier to look at with a critical lens than faithful recreations that aim to change nothing but mostly superficial things like resolution. It would add more variety to Microsoft's rotation of game releases with the added benefit of having a legacy fan base they inherited from Nintendo, which is much more of a worldwide brand than they are in terms of perception. And of course, all of this should eventually lead to a new game in the series. Whether that game be Banjo-Threeie literally or not isn't important to me. What I do think is that the next game and the games that follow should not only be referential to Banjo-Kazooie in practice, but also in theory. What I mean by that is I don't only want them to learn from their contemporaries, they need to challenge them in turn to grow. I want the next Banjo game to be something that the Mario team over at EPD looks at and feels challenged by. The original Banjo-Kazooie game was great because Rare strived to stand out in conversations about Mario 64. I think it's important to a modern Banjo-Kazooie game success for it to be developed with the modern day in mind as well in the same way. Don't just try to be Banjo-Kazooie's past. Bring Banjo into modern day and aim to continue to move the medium forward like the original game's team did. I think Playtonic's downfall with Yooka-Laylee was that they failed to do exactly that. It looked downright archaic when compared to Super Mario Odyssey, a game that takes some pretty direct inspiration from Banjo-Kazooie to begin with. It effectively ended what was once a give and take relationship, and I think it's about time that a new Banjo-Kazooie game gave something again. There's absolutely no need to go open world. I think going in that direction would not only make it hard, if not impossible, to make interesting platforming challenges, it would also make it even more difficult to make a coherent world that also accomplishes the aforementioned near impossible challenge. As far as my brief gameplay ideas for the entirely new game, I think it would be cool if they figured out a way to incorporate Kazooie for use in a mode similar to Odyssey's assist mode, because having an actual physical character to control is infinitely more engaging than controlling a hat. I want them to explore the almost Metroidvania-like properties the original game had with its unlockable abilities. Given the fact that this is a Microsoft-owned property, I'd love to see them implement a system that make achievements feel tangible and less like optional chores to get you to engage with the game in more ways than the design of the game itself encourages the player to do. Maybe that would even convince Nintendo to include them in their games, make them less about a digital pat on the back and more of a thing that feels additive to the experience overall. Keep the goofy charm like the cartoonish gibberish and the over-the-top personalities of the characters in the world, and keep Grant Kirkhope. I'm sure he'd be down to compose for future Banjo games. What do you think? Do you plan to get the Banjo-Kazooie Smash Bros. DLC? Would you play a from the ground up remake of Banjo-Kazooie on Nintendo Switch? Would you play a brand new Banjo-Kazooie game on Nintendo Switch? Even Xbox or PC? Have you played the original games? Do you have any ideas for the new games that we're talking about here? Let me know that and more in the comments down below. If you enjoyed this video, please let me know by clicking the like button and sharing it with a friend that also wants to see brand new Banjo-Kazooie games make their way to modern day consoles. Hashtag save the banjo or whatever. And be sure to subscribe and ring the bell for more videos like this every Tuesday and Thursday at 4 p.m. Eastern Time. If you want even more fanatixfour content, we post a brand new episode of our podcast every Saturday on our second channel directly to you. All of that is linked in the description below. Okay, that's it for me. See you next week.